In this video, I want to show you 3 ways you can get your data into Google Colab and talk about a few pros and cons for each. If you want to follow along, you can get the notebook and the data that I'm using from the links in the description below. To open the notebook, all you need to do is click File, then Open Notebook, then GitHub, and paste the GitHub link from the description into the first line. Once the notebook opens, you'll see here that I've listed out the differences between importing data into Excel and importing data into Python. In Python, we can load a lot of the same data sources like a CSV or an XLSX, and we're gonna use the read Excel function of pandas or the read CSV function of pandas to do that. And while these functions are pretty straightforward, the harder part about using data in Google Colab is actually getting the data into a folder where Colab is able to find it. We're gonna talk in this video about 3 different ways that we can do that. The first is by uploading it to session storage. The second is by loading it from your Google Drive. And the last one is by loading it directly from a URL. Let's jump in and let's talk about how you can import data from your session storage. To do this, all you need to do is go over here on the left, and where you find this folder icon, you just click on that. And then what we need to do is then click on this document with the up arrow. And when we do that, that is then going to pull up our data sets off of our computer. So if your data lives on your computer, you can now just find the data set that you want to use. And in this case, I'm going to use this failed banks file. So I'm just going to double click on that. And it gives me a reminder here. And this is an important thing to point out with session storage. And that is that when we walk away from our Google Colab for a little while, any data that we've uploaded through our session storage will be deleted. And that's obviously one of the negative sides of using session storage for this is every time you run this notebook, you have to go in and re-upload the file. And if you have several files, that can get pretty tedious. And in a moment, we'll talk about how the other ways that we import data can actually help us to get around this problem of having our runtime recycled. For now, I'm just gonna click OK. And then what I want to do is I'm gonna scroll down here in the notebook. And we're going to need to still import the packages that we want to use for our code. As I mentioned, we're going to use pandas primarily to load our data. So I'm going to say import pandas as PD. And then I also want to import the NumPy package. Now we can use pandas read underscore CSV function. To do that, we're gonna tell pandas, so we're gonna say PD, and then we're gonna say dot. And that dot is then going to give us access to that read Excel function. So now we're gonna say read. And as you can see from this list, pandas is not only able to read in just CSVs and Excels, it can also pull in other things like JSON, which is a type of data that's used across the web. It can pull in HTML, and it can even pull in data from your clipboard. In this case, we're just gonna use read Excel. And then I'm going to put parentheses to start that function. So now what I need to do, if you look up here, and if you just need some reference, you can see we need to give it the file name. And then we need to tell it what sheet we want the data to be pulled from. So in this case, our file name is just going to be this failed banks. And as a nice little shortcut, what you can actually do is you can come over here and click on these 3 dots, and then you can copy the path. And then when we do that, we can then come over and press Control V to paste that. And this can be helpful because sometimes I forget when I'm loading in data that it has that content folder at the beginning that we need to make sure we include. And then we also need to wrap it in either single or double tick quotes so that pandas knows that it's dealing with a string here. Now we need to tell it what sheet name we want it to pull in. So I'm going to say sheet underscore name and set that equal. And if we jump over to Excel and look at this file, you'll notice that we have 3 different tabs. We have one called banks, one called detail, and one called dividends. And so this data is data that comes from the FDIC, which is the government organization in the United States that manages different banks and helps to prevent them from failing. But every once in a while, banks do fail when they're mismanaging things. And this data includes a list of all the banks that have failed since the year 2000. For this example, and throughout the rest of this tutorial, I'm going to be pulling in data from this detailed tab. So let's jump back over to Colab. And now all we need to do is give it the name of that detailed tab that we want to load in. So now if I just take the single ticks and I type in the word detail, now before we run this, we need to make sure we also run this cell to import our packages. So I can do that by clicking the play button or by pressing Control Enter. So we run that, we get the green check mark saying that we're okay. And now let's run this to import our data. So when I run that, you see that I have a green check mark. And so our data has now been saved into a variable called bank underscore detail. So now let's run this next cell and make sure the data imported the way we expect. And it looks like it did. From here, you could start then to use Python to break down and run analysis on this data set. But again, you would run into the problem where down the road, you would come back to this analysis and you would have to go through and you'd have to click to upload your data again. If you want to avoid that, you could actually instead put the data onto your Google Drive. So let me show you how to do that. So if we scroll down, and there are two main ways that you can import data from your Google Drive. So the first way to do that is by, as you see here in the image, by clicking, instead of clicking on the upload folder, we're going to click on the folder with a Google Drive icon over here on the left. And when we do that, that's going to ask us if we want to then connect or mount our Google Drive into this notebook. So let's click to say connect to Google Drive. Once that finishes running, you can now see that we have a folder for our drive up here, where we can expand it out. We can see the My Drive and see different types of data that we have in here. Once you're done pulling in data from your Google Drive, or if you don't want to be connected to your Google Drive anymore, you can then just click on this icon again to unmount your drive and revoke access to that. This will also restart your runtime, so you may have to rerun your import packages. As you notice, these brackets are now blank, which means we do need to run this code again. And one of the things I want to point out here is now if I try to run this, you'll notice that since my runtime restarted, I no longer have that data. So if I wanted to rerun this, I would then have to go through and click to then upload my data into this again. Now, if I run that, we see that our code has worked. The other way you can connect your Google Drive is by using Python code. And this is code that you can look up online, but you can also get the same code by going over to the left bar here, where you see these two brackets that look like the less than greater than sign, and it says code snippets. If we open that up, and then underneath this filter code snippet search, if we type in mount, you can see that it says there's an option to then mount your Google Drive into your VM. And VM in this case just stands for virtual machine, and that's the machine that Google is running all of our code on. So we want to do that. So what we can do is we can actually just come down here and you can click on insert to insert the code, and then you can just close out of these code snippets on the side. So now if I run this very first box here, you'll see that it then asks me again to connect to my Google Drive. And it's going to then also ask me which account I want to use for the Google Drive. And I then have to allow it to attach to the drive here. So now this will run. This will take a moment to run and mount to the drive. This second cell here, or this second block of code that it gave us, is just some example code that if you want, you can run this. But what this is going to do is this is just going to open up a file from your Google Drive. We don't necessarily want this because we want to open data. If running this code doesn't pull up your Google Drive, you may have to restart your runtime and run it again. I've noticed that sometimes this code can be a little bit finicky, so just keep that in mind. Now that we have the drive connected over here, we can navigate. I'm just going to open up and I want to see where I've saved my Feldbanks file. It should be here in my data sets, and there you can see it. Again, I'm going to use that trick and copy the path here, especially now that we're several levels down in this folder structure. It's going to be really helpful to have that path. So in this case, we're still using an Excel file. So I'm going to say pd.read_Excel, just like we did above. And then I'm going to give it the file name inside of the ticks for the string. And as you can see, it's a much longer path this time. So that saved us the pain of manually having to type in that path. Okay, now just like we did above, we also need to then give it that same sheet name argument and set that equal to detail. So now I'm going to just press Control Enter to run that. And then let's go down here to the next cell and let's just make sure our data loaded correctly. And it looks like it did. Perfect. Now you know how to load data by uploading it to your session storage and your Google Drive. Now, the last major way to import your data into Google Colab is by importing it directly from a URL. And so to do this, I've actually uploaded this Feldbanks data and a few other data sets to my GitHub. And so if you click on this link here in the notebook, this will actually take you to the GitHub. I'm also going to put the link to this data set in the description. Over on GitHub, you can see several folders with different data that I've uploaded for this video and for future YouTube videos. And in this case, we're using the Feldbanks data. So I'm going to click into that folder, and you can see now that I have that Feldbanks SLSX that we have. So if I then just click on that file name, it then takes me into where the file is being stored. To actually get this into Colab now, I need the raw version. And I want to show you something here. So if I click on View Raw, what it will do is it will actually download that data set. And that's not what I want. I don't want to download it and have to re-upload it. To get this into Colab, what I need is I need the address or the URL for where this data is living. And I can get that by going over and hovering over this View Raw. If you look in the very bottom left side of my screen here, you can see the full URL. So all I need to do now is to right click on view raw and then copy the link address. Back over in Python now, I can take that path that I just saved and then paste it into these single ticks. So now I have my URL, and now what I can do is I can use that URL inside of the read Excel function. So let me show you how that works. So we're gonna go ahead and run this, and we're gonna save it into this variable called feldbank path. I'm gonna copy this variable name because I'm gonna need it here in a second. And then in this next line, I'm going to then take the data and I'm gonna read it in from that URL and save it into a new data set called bank detail web. So once again, I'm gonna do the read Excel function. And then instead of giving it the name of a file on my drive or uploaded my session storage, I'm gonna give it that feldbank path. And so it's gonna work pretty similarly where it's gonna give it the string of the location, but now I've just saved it to this variable. Like we did above, we also need to then say sheet name equals detail, and then we can run that. You notice that that ran properly, and then if we run the next cell, we can now see that we have the exact same data that we had in the other two examples. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.